My name is Claire Dawson, I'm 34 years old. And the day my mother looked me in the eyes and said, "You don't deserve my help," something inside me broke long before the infection reached the bone in my leg. I was standing in my parents' kitchen in Franklin, Tennessee, leaning against a cane with my hospital folder pressed to my chest, asking for $4,100 so the surgeon could remove the infected hardware from my left tibia before it became permanent damage. I didn't ask for charity. I walked in with a repayment agreement already printed, offering monthly installments with interest because I wanted them to know I wasn't begging. My mother barely looked at the papers. She folded her arms and said she'd already spent the money on something the family actually needed. Then she stared straight through me and quietly said, "You don't deserve my help." My older sister, Madison, was on a video call from Nashville, rolled her eyes, and told me I'd figure it out because I always did. My father never defended me. He just kept watching the backyard through the window like the grass was somehow more important than his own daughter. I remember thanking them for listening because I refused to let them watch me cry. As I stepped onto the driveway, my younger brother Ethan pulled in, jumped out of his truck, and handed me a small envelope with $600 inside. His voice shook as he admitted he'd sold his hunting rifle that morning because it was the only valuable thing he owned. I hugged him without saying a word because I knew exactly what that rifle meant to him. What none of us knew that evening was that my mother had quietly signed papers nearly 4 months earlier, papers that would eventually hand me the one opportunity she'd spent years trying to keep from me. 9 months later, I sold something no one believed I legally owned. And that's when my entire family finally understood exactly who they had underestimated, when I got home that night. I spread every bill across my kitchen table in Murfreesboro, trying to make numbers do something they simply couldn't do. My savings account held $987, my surgery had to be paid within 10 days. And the orthopedic specialist had made one thing painfully clear: if the infection reached deeper into the bone, we wouldn't be talking about recovery anymore, we'd be talking about permanent disability. I spent the next morning calling my insurance company, convinced there had to be a mistake. After 40 minutes on hold, a claims representative quietly explained that the procedure should have been covered months ago under a workplace injury claim my employer was supposed to file after the warehouse accident that crushed my leg. My stomach dropped. I immediately called the claims office, gave them my social security number, and waited while the woman searched their records. She came back a minute later and calmly said words I'll never forget. "Ma'am, there has never been a workplace injury claim filed under your name." I checked the claim number my manager had texted me after the accident. It wasn't a claim at all, it belonged to an equipment purchase order from the warehouse. Someone had lied, and because I trusted them, I had already lost precious weeks. I wanted to call my mother back and tell her everything, but then I remembered her voice saying, "You don't deserve my help." That sentence echoed louder than my own thoughts. My phone buzzed again. It was Ethan asking whether I'd found the rest of the money. I lied and told him everything was under control because I couldn't bear the thought of him selling anything else for me. Instead, I walked into my garage and stared at the one thing I had spent 8 years building with overtime pay, weekend jobs, and every bonus I'd ever earned. It wasn't just property. It was my emergency plan, my future, and the only asset legally registered in my name. By sunrise the next morning, I'd already made the hardest decision of my life, a decision my family would eventually regret far more than I ever did. 3 days later, I sold it. A restored 1969 Mustang Fastback that had belonged to my grandfather before he passed away. For years people told me never to let it go because it would only become more valuable, but sitting in a hospital bed with 2 working legs was worth more than any collector's car. A retired mechanic from Louisville, Kentucky drove down with a trailer, walked around it twice, and offered me $18,500. I accepted before he could change his mind. By that afternoon, the surgery center had received the payment in full, and 2 weeks later I was lying in an operating room listening to nurses count backward as the anesthesia took over. The surgery saved my leg, but it couldn't erase what my own family had done. Recovery lasted months, and while I learned to walk without the cane, I also quietly started putting together pieces of a puzzle that had never made sense. My grandmother had always promised that one day I'd inherit something meaningful because, as she used to say, the one who keeps the family together deserves a future too. I assumed she meant jewelry or photographs. Then one rainy afternoon an attorney from Brentwood called asking why I had never responded to the certified letters his office had mailed almost 4 months earlier. I told him I'd never received anything. He sounded surprised before asking me to come in the next morning with my driver's license. Sitting across from him, he opened a thick file and slid a stack of documents toward me. According to the signed paperwork, my grandmother had transferred ownership of a small commercial warehouse she owned outside Franklin into my name nearly a year before she died. The attorney also showed me signed delivery receipts proving someone at my parents' address had accepted every legal notice sent to me. My hand started shaking as I recognized my mother's signature on those receipts. She hadn't just refused to help pay for my surgery. She had hidden the one piece of property that legally belonged to me, believing I'd never discover it until it was too late. The attorney told me I had exactly 2 choices. I could quietly take possession of the warehouse and pretend none of it had happened, or I could exercise every legal right my grandmother had intentionally protected for me. I chose the second. The property had been leased to a local logistics company for almost 8 months. And every rent payment had been deposited into an account my mother controlled using forged management paperwork she'd filed after intercepting my legal notices. My attorney smiled for the first time during our meeting and said those documents would never survive a courtroom because ownership had never legally belonged to her. Within 6 weeks, the lease was transferred into my name, the tenant began wiring every payment directly to me, and my attorney filed a civil claim to recover every dollar collected without authorization. The first person to call wasn't my mother. It was my father. His voice sounded 20 years older as he begged me to keep lawyers out of the family. I reminded him that they had kept me out of my own future first. An hour later my mother showed up outside my townhouse demanding I sign the warehouse over because, according to her, the family had sacrificed too much to lose it. I looked at the woman who had once told me I didn't deserve $4,100 to save my leg and calmly handed her a copy of the deed with my name printed across the top. Then I informed her the warehouse had already been sold to an investment group from Nashville for $1.18 million, a deal my attorney had finalized that morning. After taxes and fees, I paid off every medical bill, replaced the Mustang with something practical, invested most of the money, and quietly started my own consulting business. The lawsuit eventually forced my mother to return the rent she'd collected, but by then it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about finally understanding that family isn't defined by the people who share your last name. It's defined by the people who stand beside you when your life falls apart. Ethan still comes over every Sunday, and the first thing I bought after everything was over wasn't a luxury car or a bigger house. It was the exact hunting rifle my brother had sacrificed for me, because unlike the rest of my family, he never once made me earn the love he gave so freely.